20 years, I kept a secret that sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and cold and impossible to pocket away. It was October of 1983 when the men with the flashlights and the clipped voices came down the logging road and I saw my life pitch on its hinge. The air that night smelled of diesel and wood smoke, and the Cascades were already carrying their first snows like white bread on the peaks. I stood on the porch of the ranch house, my hand on the banister, and watched a halo of light chew the dark where the helicopters would later sweep. I remember thinking, with a kind of small private astonishment, that the thing I had been trying to protect for 2 decades had never once asked for it. We called him Grayson because Melvin, my brother, always liked names you could call twice without thinking, like old dogs. It stuck because on the first night he learned his name, it came out of him like a cough, one rough syllable that could have been wind or promise. You take what you can make into speech and call it human enough. For a long time, that was enough. If you want to know how it began, you have to go back to a winter storm in 1963. I was 22 then, and Melvin was 25. The ranch was smaller and harder, house leaking in places, and the kerosene heater in the kitchen working like a stubborn heart. We were on the last of a pot of stew when Melvin came in, boots like dead logs, hat dripping water. He had that look men get when they've seen something that doesn't fit into any of the folders they'd kept for life, part alarm, part an odd kind of interest. "Tracks," he said, shrugging off his coat. The stove light made his wet hair shine. "Big ones, down by the north draw. Came off the road like somebody dropped a line." I laid the spoon down and watched the steam. Outside, the gale was saying things to the ridge. "You mean deer?" I said. "No," he said. He didn't smile. "Bigger." We wrapped ourselves up and took the old Jeep CJ down the logging track, lights cutting through curtains of snow. Melvin kept the engine low and the headlights off when we left the road. You learn fast to save your eyes for what you want to see. The tracks were, as he said, deeper than a man's, broader, with a drag in the prints that looked like something heavy had been carried or something long had been held close to the ground. Around them, the cedar trunks had been chewed, at the bark in neat, deliberate patterns, like a man carving marks into a post. We followed for a mile until the prints stopped at the break in the trees, where a culvert ran into a shallow ravine. There, beneath blown branches and old concrete, we found him, a hulking shape, not moving much, eyes half closed, breath steaming. He was bent at a shoulder, his coat, if you could call the fur a coat, matted with bracken and something that made Melvin go white around the mouth. We didn't know then what to do. We were ranch hands, not men who knew the language of the wild. But the sight of anything young and unsettled sets a thing in you, and Melvin had it in him to do. He crawled down, slow and careful like a man entering a hornet's nest, and crouched far enough to throw an arm across his knees. The creature watched him with a stillness that made the wind seem loud. "Easy," Melvin said, as if talking to a steer. "Come on now, we won't hurt you." It made a small sound, half a sigh, half a name, and turned its head an inch. Its face was more like a shadowed man's than anything in the books. Cheekbones, a slope of forehead, and eyes that were all patient dark. It smelled like high country and wet fur and wild onion. I stood above with the Jeep light cutting a silver circle, and for a long minute neither man nor beast moved. We wrapped him in canvas and hauled him up. I carried the lighter weight. He was heavy, but not what you'd think from the tracks. Alive, he was the size of a tall man, shoulders wide and limbed like a climber. He had calluses on his palms and a tenderness in the way he rested his head, as if he trusted that we wouldn't let him fall. Melvin cursed under his breath like a man who'd run out of sense and tried to buy time by using his tongue. Back at the house, we fed him stew warmed thin and set a kerosene lamp on the floor. The kitchen clock ticked like an accusing judge. He ate with no hurry, lifting the spoon with large fingers that trembled once and steadied. When the food was gone, he sat and watched the fire like a man at prayer. That's when he made his single, rough sound, Grayson, with that raspy exhale. We could have called men then. We could have called the forestry service or the sheriff. Hell, the right thing would have been to ring up someone official, put everything on record. But our world then was small, and our hands were used to fixing things without asking. Melvin saw a creature in need, and his chest folded around that like a blanket. He said nothing about paperwork. He said nothing about reputations. He said only, "We can't leave him out there." So we fed him and we hid him. We told ourselves stories about animal placement and migration. We made excuses when the neighbors came around and asked about the missing feed. We drove shipments of old blankets and hay to a lean-to above the barn where he could sleep in the dry. In the daylight, he stayed there, hunched and quiet. At night, he sat by the woodpile and watched the stars with a stillness that felt like grief. The first winter, he would not take to the world on his own. He learned the sound of a spoon against enamel and the cadence of our boots on the porch. He learned names. The first, I think, because Melvin spoke it slow and with a kind of insistence. "Gray," he'd say. "Grayson. Gray." When he started answering, that rasp, one syllable pushed out like someone clearing a throat, I remember Melvin laughing, the sound thin and tight. "There," he said, "that's a name." Over the years, the barn and the cave became his range. There was a hollow up the hill, a line of sinkholes and limestone that led into a narrow passage. We cleared one mouth, put a warning sign we tore off a logging crate, and let him in where the cold held steady and the wind could not find him. The cave suited him. He moved in the dark like a man who had lived half his life in the low light of furrows. Inside the deeper room, he began to make things. At first, they were simple. A line of carved stones he arranged by size, thumbprints pressed into clay, a ring of twigs bound with braid. Later, when he grew bolder and started going out to the ridges, he came back with things. A child's boot with a button, a brass buckle, a little watch whose face was cracked and silent. When he set these objects down in the cave beside one of his stones, he would stand for a long time and lay a hand on the shoulder of the smallest stone, as if blessing it, and then hump his frame and scrape a notch into the wall. The marks he made looked like maps, or like a story you could not quite read. We argued about what to do with the things. "Put them on a shelf," Melvin said. "Burn them," I said. We buried some in the garden until the thaw, then let them rise like secrets again. Melvin, after the first year, started making small wooden figures, simple slices of cedar carved into rough people, faces only hinted at, and left them by the cave mouth. Grayson would add his own marks, a stick stabbed upright, feathers, a line of small stones. You could stand there in the damp light and feel like you'd walked into a private liturgy of a creature who mourned in the manner he could. I learned how to read his gestures over time. A hand on my shoulder meant he was glad I was there. A slow blink when he watched me clean a rifle or mend a fence meant trust. He'd put that huge hand on Melvin's face like a doctor checking a patient, and Melvin would grin and put his own fingers through that fur like you do with a stubborn old hound. Sometimes at night, by the kerosene lamp, Grayson would sit with his back against the stove and pull a cloth from his great pouch and take out a scrap of something soft, fabric, a ribbon, and press it to his mouth with an expression that read like prayer. People who met him later, scientists, soldiers, men with clipboards, said he was an animal. They used clinical words: specimen, behavior pattern, territoriality. They were not wrong. He was animal in many ways. He nested, he foraged, he groomed. But the things he did that staggered any clear classification were the small acts you can't label without losing the feeling behind them. The way he arranged pebbles to mark the passage of seasons, the way he'd stop at the foot of the old apple tree and stand statue still as if listening for something only he could hear, the way his fingers would press into the lining of a canvas pack and pull out a little carved figure to set on a stone and then back away. Years slipped by in that rhythm. The ranch did its work. People came and went. Neighbors, loggers, a couple of transient hands in the summers. We grew a few cattle, fixed tractors, and paid taxes on time. Melvin married once, to a woman who could cook with a hurt gentleness, and then he didn't. Life seemed to hold us gently, but not forever. We marked births and funerals and the winters that came hard. I took Polaroid pictures of Grayson through those years. You can still find them tucked in a shoebox in the crawl space if you know where to look. A blurry, unfocused thing of shoulders and fur, a hand the size of a frying pan reaching for a bowl, Melvin squatting beside him with his arm thrown over his shoulder. The Polaroids developed in the kitchen sink, and the images came slow, like a thing remembering itself. We kept them more for ourselves than for any proof. Proof is a dangerous thing. It invites men with lists to lay their hands on a life and weigh it in their ledger. The cave drawings grew more complex. He began to scratch into the limestone itself. At first, they were simple line figures, animals and trees, a series of dots and arrows that I guessed were seasons or paths. Later, he outlined a shape that made my throat tight, a small figure standing beneath a larger one with hands outstretched, and beside them, a series of marks that looked like dates, more like marks of time than numbers. Around these etchings he made small shrines, a ring of river stones, the shell of what might have been a pocket watch, a fragment of fabric sewn into a flat pouch. Sometimes he arranged these things in patterns that reminded me of the way our mother used to lay out bread at the table, out of habit, out of ritual. In the summers, he would go beyond the fences and bring back more than artifacts, sometimes a newspaper corner, sometimes a boot, sometimes nothing but a smell of smoke in camp. We tried to piece together where he went. Melvin, who could walk a ridge blindfolded, followed tracks once and found a clearing where men had camped with canvas and a smokestack, and a faint stamp of military paint on a can. He came back with a face like weather-beaten wood and said, "There's more out there, Stan." That was the first time anyone said the word aloud. We kept the secret because secrecy was easier than the alternatives. We kept it out of a kind of stubborn affection and out of fear. Fear that men who had papers and uniforms would take him and make him into something else, a thing in a crate or a subject on a table. We saved him because he trusted us. And once you fold around a thing like that, you start to feel the shape of responsibility, as if it were the only moral geometry you know. Once, a hunter came by with a hound and a grin and a belly full of his own certainty. He'd spotted tracks and thought to make sport of it, something to throw on the Tuesday night bar fight. He paid no mind to our warning. The dog found a scent and went raw and loud. I remember Melvin's hand, flat on my shoulder, the old gesture, and the way Grayson came up like slow thunder from the shadow of the barn. He didn't move to strike the hunter. He stood there, tall as a freight post, hair like a curtain, and breathed. The dog went whimpering, and the hunter went white and left without his swagger. There was no need for violence. The show of stature and that steady, deliberate presence kept the danger at a distance. Still, that night, we burned the hunter in our talks. We thought of how little men could comprehend preservation when their pleasure was to kill. That helped keep us quiet. Time makes of secrecy a kind of economy. You make small sacrifices and they compound. You keep the logs out of the central shed because an inspector might see the scratch marks. You tell the county agent that you've had rodent trouble rather than explain why there are tufts of fur in your gate. Melvin taught me to be inventive with lies that sound like truth. You learn the anatomy of a good denial and how to speak it without giving your throat away. For a long time, the world left us alone. The thing we sheltered was not the kind to stroll down Main Street and cause a scandal. He kept to the ridges and the cave, came for food, and arranged stones. He was, by most measures, a quiet tenant of the land. But nothing stays unseen forever, not in the modern world with its hungry machines and its men who are paid to notice. The first small crack came when a survey crew from the state turned up in the spring of '82, mapping a possible route for a new access road. They were young, polite, and harried, with slick maps and a company cap. They laid stakes and measured the bend in the creek and left with a few cigarette butts and a faint knowledge that there was a place you might not want to cross. A year later, in the dry of September '83, a different sort of surveyor came with a clipboard stamped with a different department. He was careful-handed, and he had a way of making small talk for 2 minutes and then slipping into a kind of professional distance. He asked questions about boundaries and easements and never asked the right ones. But the men with the measuring rods found the cave entrance and took a look, and men are built to tell what they see. The ledger men wrote in their notebooks. The man with the clipboard sent a radio message back to the office. Found a set of etchings and a cleared entrance. Looks like habitual occupation. Recommend follow-up. That was how the chain began. Paperwork breeds other paperwork the way small leaks breed flood. The message bounced its way through to someone, who forwarded it to someone else, until one morning in October, a woman with a tidy bun and a steady jaw drove up in an old Ford F-250 and knocked at our door. She called herself Jenny Blackwood, and she did not come like the pictures in those dime novels. No big introduction, no dramatic reveal. She came with a notebook and a small Polaroid of her own, and gloves folded into the back pocket. She had seen etchings and limestone scars before. You could tell by the way she cocked her head at the angle of a scratching. She said she was a biologist, mostly office work, but that sometimes she did field checks. Routine, she said, as if routine could carry the weight of what men usually found. Melvin let her look around because sometimes an outsider is a useful thing. You let someone in so you can see what they'll do before the men with pins and power show up. He watched her the way a man watches a river rock, looked for how it would go if pushed. She bent to the cave mouth with no drama and peered in. Grayson, who'd been a shadow at the far wall with a sleeping blanket, came forward to see the newcomer. He watched Jenny with that same slow attention he had for everything. She took a Polaroid of him and waited for the image to develop. When it came up, it had the faint halo that comes with poor light, a silhouette of fur and a human-sized shoulder. She studied it, and then she looked up at us with eyes that were careful to be kind and careful to be professional. "I've seen a few things in my time," she said. "This is not what I'd expect to find in a ranch cave." "What's it look like, doctor?" Melvin asked, chest out, protecting the thing like a pail. He had always been a man of muscle before subtlety, and you could see the muscles of his shoulders coiling at the implication that someone meant to take. "It looks like an animal that has been living in close contact with humans," Jenny said. "It has ritual scars, object use, possible burials. Those aren't marks that just happen. They might be signs of an intelligence we don't easily quantify." "It's lived with us 20 years, I said. "Say the truth, and the mouth goes cold. It saved itself, and we kept it." Jenny's face softened but didn't fold. "You kept it," she said. "That changes things, legally and ethically." Those words, legal and ethical, are like a cold wind in the rafters. They are instruments that measure a thing by a ledger and not by the skin of it. She stayed longer than we expected. She took samples. Hair clippings from a brush Melvin had fashioned from boar bristles. A smear from a dipper where Grayson had used the edge to clean his fur. And she told us, with an economy that hid worry, that this might require protection. "There's precedent," she said. "If it's a distinct population with unique behaviors, there's a chance we can file emergency measures." Melvin wanted to trust her. He had that tendency in him. If a woman looked like she knew what she was doing, Melvin would throw in his lot with her. He liked the idea of law being on our side, because law has a loud voice, and sometimes that voice can drown out the men who want to kill what they cannot stomach. I was less certain. I had seen laws twist like roots around the wrong things before. In the end, we let her take the samples, because what else does a man do when the alternative is to sink into the smallness of his own fear? Jenny worked with a quiet intensity. She took notes as if the future might ask unpleasant questions. "Do you have any records?" she asked, meaning photographs, a log of sightings, anything that might make what we said into something other men could read. We showed her the Polaroids, the cave sketches Melvin had traced into a pad, and the plays of small wooden figures we'd kept. She lifted the pages as if they were bones and turned them gently. "This could be a moment," she said. "If we do it right, we can protect this population and avoid it being turned into something like a circus or an experiment." I wanted to say, "There's no salvation in the world for what we shelter, but maybe there is in the law." Instead, I said, "What's the catch?" She sighed, and for the first time her neatness slipped. Men like Major Carson Hodgage don't see things as we do. He sees containment and study and control. He has ways to expedite matters. She used the word with caution, and it hung. If we file an emergency status, they'll come with their own people. I put my hand on the shelf where the Polaroids lay. Grayson was asleep in land in the cave that evening, his breath slow like a bell. The lamp threw a tight light across his fur. I could almost read his dream lines by the crease of his brow. You shelter something for 20 years, and you get a kind of proprietary tenderness that is not ashamed to be irrational. We had made a family of 3 on the land: me, Melvin, and the wide, mute guardian who kept to the shadows. To anyone else, he might have been evidence. To us, he was a person who kept certain nights from being bare. Jenny did what she could without making a play for the spotlight. She wrote reports, made calls, and said things like emergency assessment with the kind of professional steadiness that suggests someone has rehearsed for every bad reply. She also told us stories that didn't sound like anything out of a manual, of people who had been ruined by fame, of specimens killed in the name of science, of animals put into cages to satisfy a town's carnival appetite. She was careful to keep the Polaroids out of any casual hands. Proof does not equal safety, she told me, and I could have kissed her for saying that one honest thing. But the paper trail grows irrespective of caution. Someone up the ladder, someone who read a polite dispatch about anomalous fossil behavior, decided to take an interest. A man with a starched collar but no badges arrived in a sedan and introduced himself as Director Hammond. He was the kind of man who made conversation like a scalpel, neat, precise, and small. He asked questions I didn't want to answer, and then asked them again, with the presumption that my answers were only pauses before he asked for more. He mentioned a program of containment in a way that made Melvin squint like a man who'd been offered both a gun and a job. When Hammond's queries reached a man in the uniformed kind of power, Major Carson Hodgage, the tone of everything changed. Hodgage had a face that made men look like children. He spoke softly in a way that implied no doubt that his opinion was a fact waiting for the world to catch up. He described containment as a thing of necessity. Not for cruelty, he said one afternoon when he stood on our porch and looked out over the property, but for the public good, for study, for security. "You want to cage him," Melvin said. He had his hand on the rail. There was a noise in his voice like wood cracking. "I want to make sure he does not become a danger to people," Hodgage said, and the phrase hung like a judgment. "We can provide relocation to a secure facility, non-public, controlled, humane." "Humane," Melvin repeated, tasting the word like a coin. "For who?" Hodge's eyes were cool as a blade. "For the public, for the creature, and for the country." There are men who come into your life and the air tightens as if someone has shut a door. Hodgage had that effect. He was the sort who could fold an argument into a neat square and present it as benevolence. The trouble with benevolence is that it often means the rest of the world gets to decide for you. Jenny wanted to do it through the law. Hodgage wanted more immediate measures. We stood in a set of crossed reasons and couldn't find a bridge. Our small proofs, the Polaroids, the cave drawings, the wooden figures, looked suddenly like childish talismans in a room full of men with clipboards and plans. The object of all attention, Grayson, watched from the mouth of his cave like a quiet god. He had never asked for any of this, and the thought of papers or cages on him made my stomach fold. The first real outcry came a week after Hammond's visit, when a local logging crew reported an old boot and a watch in a ravine. The watch had a family engraving faded by time. The men told the sheriff, and the sheriff called the press, and the press called people who liked stories that could be printed in bold type. Suddenly, the ranch was a place where curiosity liked to gather. We had an angry family come through, a family looking for closure for someone who had walked into the woods and never come home. They cried in my kitchen, and I held their hands and said the things men say when they have nothing but themselves to hand over. Grayson's shrine held objects that might be human things, and that fact crowded the room with a different kind of threat. "You kept this here for 20 years, the matriarch told me, her voice a thin line. "You kept what might have been my son's things. How could you keep my son's things?" I had no clean answer. What I had was the manifold weight of a decision that is not single-sided. "We thought we were saving a life," I said. "We thought it was never about theft." The words fell useless on the table. Her grief is like a bright coal that will not be buried. The county deputy took statements. Jenny signed forms and promised to press for an emergency listing. Melvin paced the yard like a man who'd been set lit with questions and didn't have a ready answer. We had kept things in the dark, and the world was now an engine raising its hood to our lives. Hodgage arrived with his men, with clipped orders and tents, with a helicopter that turned the night into a daylight of its own. The rotor wash stripped the leaves from the trees and dropped them back like a shower. Soldiers spread canvas and set up a perimeter. They propped up a sign that looked for all the world like a claim: Authorized Exclusion Zone. Lights lit up the ridgelines, and an unfamiliar language of ropes and steel and procedure began to hum through the valley. They were professional and quiet, and I could not find in them any visible thirst for cruelty, only a practiced belief that their orders were what mattered. Hodgage spoke to us with a patient voice, as if he were a teacher disappointed in a child. "We can make a humane plan," he said. "Shipment to a facility where he will be studied, where he will be safe." Melvin spat in the dirt. "Safe from what? From being our neighbor? From being our family? I don't give a damn for laboratories that call themselves safe." "You don't have to like it," Hodgage said. "You have to accept it's necessary." "You come out here with your lights and you don't even know if the things you claim as necessary are the right thing to do," Jenny said. She had not left our side once, and she looked tired in a way that suggested she'd tried to do it all without the force she now confronted. "We need time to file. We need due process." Hodgage smiled thinly. "Due process is a lovely idea, but the nation doesn't slow down for ideas when there's a potential biological risk. There's protocol." It was the word protocol that did the real work. Men trained to follow procedures see things as tasks, not as people. They will go about tasks with a clarity that creates ruin. I knew that because I'd been a man who once followed orders and found the outcome hollow. We tried to make a stand. Melvin wanted to put up a barricade, to block the logging road with our trucks. I wanted to call an attorney, someone who could speak the language of law and the language of preservation at once. Jenny kept insisting on a legal filing, a temporary protective order. In our kitchen, we argued like a family in winter, voices rising and falling until the kerosene heater sounded like an exhale. In the end, we were pushed by the arrival of men who had been trained to be patient. Hodgage came with offers that smelled of sugar: relocation, confidentiality agreements, a check for the inconvenience. He came with the suggestion of forced compliance as well as legal threats. Men who have had secrets like ours know the hard truth. If the federal machinery wants your silence, it knows how to promise you a smaller life in exchange for cooperation. They offered us a form. It was a neat paper that would bind our mouths and ship the creature to an undisclosed facility. They called it a conservation transfer. Melvin read it like a man reading a will. "It's paperwork," he said, and his voice broke. "It's burial in ink." "You sign and you reduce harm," Hodges said. "You refuse and we will take measures that are less cooperative." There are moments when you realize you are a small thing between two larger machines. You can resist and be crushed, or you can take the bargain and live with the price. We signed. I do not like the memory of the pen. how the ink felt like a needle. We signed because we were afraid of the consequences of resistance, and because the thought of Grayson in a crate given to men with clipboards made us tremble in ways that no law could soothe. The morning the transport arrived, Grayson sat at the mouth of the cave and watched us packing the wooden figures into a crate. He did not cry out. He did not make a sound that would ever equal the noise a human makes when the thing they love is taken from them. He dug a thumb into the earth and brushed the dirt over a ring of stones, then stood and put his hand on the shoulder of the nearest carved figure and waited. Melvin went to him and put his own hand over that great hand. For a second, the two of them were like two old farmers touching the same tool before a harvest. "When they take you," Melvin said, and his voice had another kind of breaking in it, "you'll do what you do. Remember us." Grayson inhaled and made a sound that might have been a laugh. He pressed his forehead to Melvin's with a gesture I would later describe to court journals as a sign of trust. He humped his body and let the handlers come near. He did not resist in the way the men expected. He climbed into their crate with an almost ceremonial slowness, as if he understood the gravity of being picked up like a burden. They closed the door. We watched the handlers check the latches. Hodges hugged an arm against his chest like a man closing a briefcase. They took him away in a truck with a canopy. The road swallowed the rumble and the lights. The helicopter that had circled like a scalded bird lifted and followed. I stood on the porch with a Polaroid in my hand that had developed into an image of a shadow. Melvin leaned into me and said nothing. Nothing had ever felt this large. The silence that is not the absence of noise, but the presence of a thing removed. In the weeks that followed, men in suits came and took samples, asked questions that felt like combs through our lives, and offered us small sums to keep quiet. We were told, for the good of the creature, for the good of stability, for the good of everything that must be kept orderly. Jenny left us with a small car full of lab notes and a promise that she would push for transparency. She did what she could within the rules, which are not always kind to hearts. She filed petitions and sent photographs to a lab that smelled like formaldehyde and ambition. She wrote to a lawyer in town who specialized in environmental law and begged him to consider a restraining action. The law, when it finally touched the matter, had an excruciating slowness. Months is a long time when what you want is the immediate. We thought that would be the end of it. We believed that the men with clipboards had the sense to treat what they had with a kind of cold care. We were wrong. The picture the government painted was neat. Hodges' men made a case file. Grayson was a potential threat, possibly implicated in the disappearance of hikers and a child long ago. He used objects and possibly human detritus in what they called territorial marking. There was no evidence of predation that could stand up to the light of a fair inquiry. The stories were remade into a threat narrative that suited paperwork and the appetite of a public that wants simple monsters. In their files, they used a word that made my skin crawl: hazard. They were thorough in the way bureaucratic men are: neat labels, checkboxes ticked, recommended actions circled in red. There were hearings and closed-door meetings and an attorney who kept himself immaculate and said the same things in the same level voice. A public relations man wrote a short statement about safety, about the need to manage unknown risks. Melvin and I sat through those hearings and felt the weight of something vast running over us like a storm. They presented their case as if the creature were the variable and not the locus of all that had been done to him by men. We wanted to fight in the primitive ways men do, but the legal path is a river with its own current. Jenny tried to navigate it. She was fierce in the way of someone who believes in the possibility of law. She argued that the creature's behaviors, rituals, object arrangement, possible mourning, constituted evidence that he deserved protection under an emergency listing. Hodges argued that immediate containment and relocation were necessary to protect communities. Both of them used language that sounded to me less like truth and more like the equipment of the machine. In the end, we were left with small illusions.
Grayson was moved to a facility in a place that smelled of antiseptic and fear. They told us they would study him to determine his cognitive status and to devise measures to keep him safe. They said we could visit under supervision. The crate left the light of our valley and carried with it 2 decades of ritual and the slow, small life we had stitched around him. I did visit once, months later, and the memory of that room is a needle in my ribs.
He was behind a partition of thick glass and canvas, and the men in the white coats approached him with clipboards like priests reading from scrolls. He sat back from them with that same studied calm and arranged a new set of stones on the concrete floor. He took a small worn figure from his sleeve, a wooden person Melvin had carved, and placed it near the edge where light touched the concrete. He looked at me with a hand raised to his mouth in the old manner, as if he tasted the air. He tapped the glass once with a slow finger, and when I placed my palm against the cold pane, he placed his over mine on his side. It was the same motion he'd always given, hand on shoulder, hand on palms. But this time the barrier was between us. The touch was separated by 100 pounds of manufacture. He did not make a sound that might have been the old syllable of his name. He only sat and arranged the stones and watched the men with clipboards and the lights and the cameras. Jenny stood beside me with her arms folded and eyes bright. She had done what she could. We were all complicit in different ways. I met her gaze and found in it a sorrow that sounded like ours. "They'll learn something," she said, "or they'll teach them what they want to know." In my dreams after that, I would see Grayson at the cave mouth, thumb pressed on a carved figure, and I would wake with the taste of ash. The machinery of institutions is precise in ways that exhaust the heart. They organized data and filled forms and sent memos about the creature's grooming habits and the angle of his etchings. The men who studied him wanted conclusions in order to manage risk and to assign funds. The men who governed him wanted containment and reports that could be filed and shelved. What came next was less dramatic than expected, and yet more devastating in a low, enduring way. The facility announced they had to relocate him for his own safety, to a government-run facility with better controls and more security. They assured us that his needs would be met. We were presented with papers and a transfer schedule and told in quiet legalese that this was a non-public operation for the good of all. They told us that, in time, we would be allowed to visit and that we must not speak of the details lest we jeopardize the creature's well-being. Years later, I would discover that the memorial chamber in the cave held more than trinkets. After the evacuation, when the government men had gone back to their files and their neat rows, neighbors went into the cave to see what the creature had left behind. They found, deeper than we'd known, a cluster of personal items arranged around a shallow depression: a watch, a child's little tin soldier, a pendant with an inscription worn nearly smooth. There were no bodies, at least not in ways a farmer would call a body. There were bones that looked old and small, bleached, arranged like offerings, and beside them a carved plaque with a series of marks Grayson had made over years. The discovery of those items inflamed what had been a simmering conflict. Men with collars who had not been there 2 decades ago read into those objects a narrative of danger. They said this was evidence of predation. They said the creature had kept trophies. Families raged. The press made a meal of the found items, and the men who had once called us friends stopped dropping by for coffee. Jenny stood between those narratives. She argued that the objects might just as easily be offerings from others, stuff Grayson found and arranged as part of his mourning. She said we must not conflate artifact with confession. The world does not like ambiguity. It prefers monsters it can draw up on paper with dark ink and give a label to. The evidence was the kind of mess that could be read in more than one key. For a time, the lawyers and the directors and the men of procedure decided to keep the story quiet. A settlement was offered to Melvin and me, a small sum and a condition that we not talk about the specifics. There was also, less spoken, a pressure to sell the ranch.
The facility wanted to expand a perimeter, to own the valley in the name of science. Melvin and I looked at each other across the kitchen table and measured what two men could do against what men with folders and funds intended. We chose the compromise they offered. We sold the ranch to a trust and moved to a smaller place down the road. Sometimes when I wake early, I can still feel the edge of the barn under my hand, like a memory of a tool. The compromise has the aftertaste of grief. You save what you can, and you trade the rest for sleep. We were left with certain small things: a crate of Polaroids, the memory of the hand on shoulder, the scratches in the cave, etched by thumb and stone. We were left with the knowledge that the creature had been more than our enemy or our curiosity. He had been, in his own way, a keeper of memories that the world had no category for. In the years after the transfer, rumor fed rumor. Some said Grayson thrived at the facility, that he was being studied and tended. Others said he withered in a place not built for him. Someone posted a letter to the local paper, signed by a former handler, claiming he'd seen Grayson at night, pacing in a small pad, eyes bright with a wildness that was not anger but a sorrow like a quiet bell. No one knew, and perhaps no one would ever know for certain. The men trained in protocol are proud of what they do. Their certainty is a substitute for understanding. Jenny tried for a while to keep the records alive and to write papers that argued for a different course. Her articles read like care and like plea. They made the right journals, but not the headlines. She lost her position at one point, not for the science, but for pushing too hard on the disclosure.
Men in power do not like to be contradicted, especially when the contradiction might complicate a clean narrative. When the last of the lights left the valley and we had nothing left but the empty reverence of our fenced-in years, I found myself standing at the mouth of the cave and running my hand along a line of marks. The stone was cold, and the mended residue of many winters sat like a dust on its face. Grayson had left arrangements in their stead, small piles of stones balanced neatly, feathers fixed into the grooves. I set my hand where his had once rested and felt the cold transfer into me. "Did you do the right thing?" I asked the cave, though the cave does not answer. Years later, standing on a porch and watching a helicopter searchlight bylar across the slope like a question, I would not give a different answer. We made choices as men do, with the tools available: fear, love, and whatever trust we could find in each other. I am no apologist for the compromises we made. I remember the way Melvin looked the morning they took him, how his shoulders sagged like an old man, and his laugh had left a hollow in it. I remember the hand on shoulder and the slow tap on the glass, and how a creature that had lived its life in stone and moss could hold a kind of grief you could not puncture with paperwork. I tell this now because the men who came that October of 1983 did not arrive only to take. They arrived with a story already written, and that story made certain things true by the force of repetition and the appetite of men who favor tidy endings. But the things we sheltered did not fit tidy endings. They fit a life of small rituals and odd, human-like tenderness, and the stubborn refusal to explain themselves in a way we can file. When you listen to the radio now, you hear static and stories. The static is heavy with the sound of men who keep watch. You hear voices counting and giving grid locations, and you are suddenly reminded that the world is full of people whose job it is to notice and catalog other lives. Those same people will sometimes treat a life as an entry and not as an entire weather. Sometimes at night I drive the old road to the ridge and stand where the cave mouth used to be, and I find the stones still placed in a circle where no hand has moved them for years. And I imagine a silhouette in a facility somewhere arranging a new set of pebbles on a sterile floor. I allow myself the image because we are creatures who save images we can hold in our palms. I press my thumb to the cold and recall the weight of his hand resting over mine. There are questions that have no answers that satisfy the heart. Was Grayson a predator? Was he a mourner? Was he both and neither? The men with the clipboards chose one narrative. We chose another.
The truth is a kind of slow thing that sits between, and it is possible that neither side would ever fully own it. I kept a box of the wooden figures in the crawl space for years after the sale. Sometimes, when the nights closed like a fist, I'd take one out and run a finger along its edge. Melvin, who had gone on a trip and never come back to the ranch for long, once said to me over the phone, "You did what you could, brother." He was trying to comfort himself and me. "We did," I answered, and it felt both like absolution and confession. The story does not end with complaint or with victory. It ends with a kind of quiet. We made a choice that cost us and the creature something neither of us could ever reclaim. There is sorrow in that. There is also the recognition that love and fear braided together make a rope you cannot always climb back down. On some evenings now, when the sky is a gray like old linen and the wind runs the fences thin, I look west toward the Cascades and think of a hand on a shoulder and the small arrangements of pebbles. I think of the way light falls on stone and how a creature can mark the world in a way only he understands. After 2 decades of protecting something the world wanted to catalog as monster, we discovered something more sinister, not in the animal itself, but in the ways men will decide, without you, what a life is worth. I do not tell this for pity. I tell it because secrets ripen into truth only if you tell them, and because somewhere in the hollows of the mountains there is a hollow that asks to be remembered. When the helicopters came and the men with the uniforms took what they thought they needed, they also took from us a way of being that was reflective and personal. They substituted their own terms and called it policy. We learned to live under that. We learned to bargain with our consciences. If there is a last thing I want to say, it is this: watch for the small marks. They are the only honest language some lives have. A pebble placed with care, a notch on a wall, a hand resting on a shoulder. Listen to the static on the radio and hear the old lullaby of men who think in lists. Above all, remember that the word monster is a tool men use when they wish to avoid looking in the mirror. We are all capable of the same. Perhaps the most sinister thing was not the creature at the cave mouth, but the way grown men chose neatness over nuance. I do not know where Grayson is now. The trust I felt that day he placed his hand over mine is the thing that never left. Sometimes, when the moon is low and you can smell snow on the air, I swear I can feel the imprint of that hand on my skin. It is a memory that feels like an ache and a benediction rolled into one. It will be with me for as long as my muscles remember how to be human. Outside on the horizon, lights from a distant road wink like answers that never come. Inside my chest, the memory of a hand remains where a stone sits, heavy, true, and impossible to lose.